Good evening and welcome to the OBI Public Talks. My name is Tom Mickelson. I'm the President and Scientific Director of the Ontario Brain Institute. We are a provincially funded non-for-profit working to accelerate innovation in the context of neurologic disorders. Our mission is to take data and innovative scientific advances into clinical care for folks dealing with neurologic disorders. First of all, for this evening, I want to acknowledge that I'm located in the traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg and the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississauga of the Credit First Nations. This land is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Treaty, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabeg to share and care for the resources of the Great Lakes. We obviously each have a relationship with the land on which we reside and which we flourish. We, even this morning, in the context of the Oak Ridges moraines, I'm undertaking forest bathing by cycling in the beautiful season that we have and the tremendous nature that is around us. There's obviously the riches of the Great Lakes and open water swimming and other activities I think are resonant in the topic for this evening. Obviously, there's been a big context of stress with mental health in the context of the COVID era, and activity in nature will be our salvation. So we're very grateful for the land that we have in order to be able to do movement and physical activity, which will be the topic for this evening. So the topic of tonight's discussion is finding meaning in movement. So we normally think of physical activity contributing only to physical fitness. But there's a strong evidence to support that movement, the benefits, and it protects our cognitive fitness as well, not in addition, of course, in our mental health. Movement in all its forms has profound impacts on our brains across the lifespan, from improving mental health to reducing risks of dementia, and so on. So tonight, our panel of experts is going to discuss movement as a means of staying active, maintaining healthy lifestyle choices, empowering marginalized populations, and understanding activity through the lens of inclusion in our society. So a few reminders. First of all, sign up for our upcoming public talks, the Wellness Series, which has details on our website. We are proud partners again to partner with TVO, and tonight's talk is being live streamed on tvo.org. A video of the talk will be made available on our website later this week. So during the talk, you can send your questions either by direct messaging us on Twitter at Ontario Brain, by sending us an email through communications at braininstitute.ca, or directly in the chat box found on the top right-hand corner of the screen. So our moderator for tonight is Wency Leung, a health reporter at the Globe and Mail. She's got a special interest in understanding brain health and has been looking into the various aspects of how the pandemic has affected people's mood, senses, and cognition. She's particularly drawn to stories about families and individuals living with dementia, substance abuse and addiction, and loneliness, and about the scientists and clinicians striving to help them through this time. So at this time, I'm going to invite one of the members of the Ontario Brain Institute Board of Directors, Joyce Barreto, to share a few of her thoughts. Her day job is at Stikeman Elliott and manages that firm with risk, lawyer efficiency, and technology perspective. She's currently a board director and chair of our governance committee, and has other in community engagement, including Resource Productivity and Recovery Authority, as well as the Evergreen Brickworks. So Joyce, thank you for your comments. I look forward to the evening.
Thank you, Tom, for your kind remarks. I'm currently at Ontario Health and have spent much of my career in healthcare in a variety of roles, including at the Ministry of Health and in the home and community care sector. What brought me to OBI and this public talk is my personal connection to brain health. My mother was first diagnosed with Parkinson's at the age of 70. Her declining health was not easy on us as a family. But there was one thing about my mother that gave us confidence. She wanted to do well so as not to become a burden. She simply refused to give up. Early into the diagnosis, Mom sought out physical and cognitive activities to help strengthen her brain power. We could see how that helped. Her biggest anxiety and a common expression was that she did not want to lose her marbles. Her other favorite saying, use it or lose it, which she applied both physically and cognitively. This is so true for our brain health as well. How we feel, think, and experience the world is thanks to the neural connections in our brain. This is why we must not neglect its care, nor take it for granted. Seeing a parent or your loved one slip away because of a neurological disease is not easy, which is why OBI, a leader in brain health, works with experts across Canada to support research, commercialization, and care for the 1 in 3 Canadians suffering from a brain disorder. OBI is building a system of care that helps families access the latest evidence-based information on brain health, learn tips on its application in everyday life, and ultimately take their care into their own hands. You each have already begun this journey by showing up today. My mother lived with all her marbles intact to the age of 93. She was relentless in her journey and relentless in her brain exercise routines, a true example of the power of mind over matter. I thank you for joining us tonight and hope you enjoyed the discussion.
Hi there, and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Wency Liang. I'm a health reporter with the Globe and Mail. I'm very pleased to be moderating tonight's event. Let me introduce you to our speakers. First, we have Sarah Robichaud, who is Executive Director and founder of Dancing with Parkinson's. We also have Dr. Laura Middleton, who is the Associate Professor at University of Waterloo's Department of Kinesiology. Next, we have Dr. David Howe, medical anthropologist, and Dr. Frank J. Hayden, Endowed Chair in Sport and Social Impact at Western University School of Kinesiology. Dr. Patrick Jakira, postdoctorate fellow at the Azrieli Adult Neurodevelopmental Center, CAMH, and founder of Extraordinary Youth Council. So just a reminder, please send us your questions. We have the Twitter handle and email address which will be displayed on the screen. And there is also a chat box on the right side of your screen. Please feel free to send us your questions there or chat amongst fellow participants. We also have a 2-minute planned activity for you later in the show as well. So find yourself a comfortable spot and get some movement in. So Sarah, first, let's begin with you. Your organization went virtual due to the pandemic and has reached 150 people per class, over 2,500 Canadian seniors registered. Tell me a little bit about how seniors got interested and what are they getting out of these classes?
I get so excited to talk about this. So when we had to switch to virtual classes, I was pretty worried because our dance classes are meant to be an in-person service. We do a lot of touch, we do a lot of connecting, and it's about seeing each other in the room and having this camaraderie. And so what was really, really interesting to us is that when we started offering the virtual classes to keep our community of dancers with Parkinson's connected, the fourth wall was still being broken down. So dance was still able to sort of break down the barriers of age, race, religion, language, but also technology. The dancers were coming each and every day and saying, this is helping me feel less isolated during this time. We actually undertook an evaluation with the Evaluation Center for Complex Health Interventions and found that 80% of our participants were feeling less isolated due to the classes. So not only are the dance classes that were designed for people with Parkinson's beneficial for all seniors, physically, emotionally, and cognitively, but more than anything, the seniors are coming because they feel this profound sense of community. And in fact, I mean, almost every single day after class, the classes are 20 minutes each, they're 7 days a week, they're free for all seniors. Every single day after we dance, after that 20 minutes of moving to music, we chat, we share stories. Seniors are talking to each other through all the squares on Zoom from across the country, sharing stories about their grandchildren, their struggles, their triumphs. And each and every one of them says that they feel like they are part of a big family. And to me, that sense of family and not being isolated during a time, like COVID, where seniors are clearly the most isolated population, and most affected here, it is a huge, huge magical win for dance.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah. We'll unpack some of those benefits a little later on. Let's just first go to a quick poll right now, a quick live poll, because we'd love to actually find out more about you, our viewers. There are a few ways you can participate. There is a slide that will pop up on the screen shortly with a QR code that you can scan, or you can go to slido.com and enter the hashtag TalkBrain. You can also scroll down the page where you are watching this live video on the OBI website and scan the code there. Another way you can access our poll is through a link in the chat box. And only the first 100 people will be able to participate. So our poll question is, we will want to know where you are watching us from. So where are you watching from today? Let's find out. I'm sure we have lots of Torontonians logging in. 100% Canada. Amazing. Let's see. That's great. So we have a very Canadian audience here tonight. Perfect. Sorry, with some US participants here as well. Fantastic. Let's see. There we go. 8% from US, 92% Canadian. Excellent. Great. Oh, there we go. Good to know. Great. Okay. Thank you so much for participating. Sarah, Laura had mentioned benefits such as combating loneliness and improving overall health and fitness. I wonder if you can walk us through the science behind movement and its connection to dementia and overall brain health.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, Wency. The earliest work that looked at exercise and cognitive health, or your thinking abilities, emerged around the 1950s. And what's interesting, it was all actually around soldiers and athletes, where they were looking at exhaustive exercise, and that we actually saw a little bit of a detriment in thinking abilities. But more recently, in the last 20 years, evidence has been emerging about the beneficial effects of physical activity on brain health. Between 1999 and 2000, the first population studies came out indicating that people who are more physically active had 30 to 40% reduced risk of dementia, including Alzheimer's disease, compared to those people who were least active. And that's now been replicated in many studies across the world with fairly consistent results. More recently, there's also been clinical trials of exercise looking at cognitive outcomes. And while those results have been a little bit more inconsistent, the overall, there's a positive effect of exercise, especially to what we call executive thinking function. So your higher levels of thinking abilities over periods of 3 months to a year. And these benefits seem to be underlied by changes in the brain, by changes in the level of growth factors that affect the structure of your brain, the connection between parts of your brain, as well as the blood vessels in it. And I'm talking about cognitive health, but it's important to recognize, of course, when we're talking about brain health more broadly, there's extensive evidence to suggest that there's also benefits to mental health, especially in the area of mood and depression.
Wonderful. Thank you. Patrick, let's get into that with you. Your work actually takes us to the other end of the lifespan spectrum with a focus on youth and young adults with developmental disabilities. Can you tell me a little bit about the connection of physical activity and mental health?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Wency. And I think I'm going to start off by building on what Dr. Middleton just said in terms of the impact of activity on the brain and brain health overall. So when we talk about individuals with developmental disorders, we're thinking about people diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder or ADHD or obsessive compulsive disorder, all the way through to cerebral palsy. And what we see are kind of positive impacts both across physical health domains and mental health. So this, for example, comes out to be something like people who are physically active, what we see is a decrease in the cortisol hormone, which is an indicator of stress. So people, when they're active, we see a decrease in their stress hormones. What we also see is a lower heart rate, a lower breathing rate. So activity in and of itself could be one way that we can modulate what we would call mood and anxiety and our overall feelings. So that's the mind, body, and spirit connection in a way, right? We're active physically, we're using our muscles, but it also impacts our mind. And spiritually, it might be a way that people can feel, sense of relief, especially during the pandemic, where people are isolated and are feeling sometimes, a bit challenged in ways that they've never challenged before. The other thing to think about is that physical activity provides what I would call these small doses of mental health, meaning that if we do a little bit of it every single day, it provides us with a positive feeling of experiencing a sense of structure, maybe a sense of routine, something that's predictable. And all of those little things, when you combine them together, actually function to help us, experience more positive mental health over time. The other thing that is also important is that individuals who are being physically active also experience a sense of connectedness. And we heard Sarah talk about this in dance, and what we see in young adults and youth and even adults with autism spectrum disorder is, generally speaking, they are isolated and don't have a lot of connections. And the pandemic has really exacerbated that. So any which way in which we can connect them through activity or through social groups, and if we can combine them both, that certainly is one of the many beneficial factors. And again, for this population, for people with developmental disorders, physical activity is even more important because the rates of physical activity, generally speaking, are really low in this population, but their actual experiences with mental health and physical health are really poor. So what we're trying to do in some of our work is understand what is the relationship between physical activity and mental health for these individuals, and then how can we work together with them to not only make physical activity more meaningful, but can we potentially impact their brain health and their mental health and their physical health over time, to really focus on developing the whole person rather than just picking them apart.
Very interesting. Thank you so much, Patrick. David, for you, being a medical anthropologist, can you please share your thoughts on the social impact of sport and physical activity for people with disabilities? How does it affect social inclusion and health and mobility?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. And I think that, it brings to mind the Robert Louis Stevenson character, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, because there are two sides of the coin here. On one hand, sport, physical activity, the moving body, it's absolutely wonderful. We those of us who are fortunate enough to be able to move around in the world in these COVID times and so on, are able to feel the wonder of the early summer in southwestern Ontario, where most of the talkers are based, and the nature of cleansing our minds through the movement and so on is really, really integral, and that's what the other speakers have been talking about. On the other side of the coin, physical activity, like medicine, is a form of social control. If you have a body that isn't perceived to be a body that should be engaged in sport and physical activity, those people with physical and or mental development disorders and so on might not have access to be included in the social context of sport and physical activity. So we really need to be mindful in terms of moving forward and pushing the agenda forward as a community of like-minded individuals, that there are lots of people that are excluded from the opportunity to be healthy through physical activity and sport because their body or their mind doesn't fit what we see as socially normal. And therefore we need to take the opportunity to celebrate difference in embodied forms, in mental forms, and so on, to encourage everyone to be as active as they physically possibly can.
Right, thank you. Laura, would you like to add something to this? What does the UN Convention for People with Disabilities say about the right to access to sport and physical activity?
Yeah, I think that last point by David is really important, is that some people experience much greater barrier to being active than others. And that's part of there's a number of ways you can define it, but a social construct of disability, in that the environment and the people and social environment and built environment interact with a person's ability to influence their participation. Now, the UN Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disability includes under the guaranteed rights a right to equal participation in sport, leisure, and recreation. And so, reducing the barriers, creating accessible, inclusive opportunities is not just something that's nice to do by people who care about the area, but is really necessary, should be considered, everything from wheelchair ramps to the way we include people with sensory deficits or cognitive impairment. We need to think about inclusion on all levels and for all sorts of different abilities.
Thank you. Let's continue the discussion on breaking down barriers in just a moment. First, we are going to get a little taste of the positive effects of movement, and we encourage you, the audience, to participate if you can. So Sarah, can you please lead us through a quick 2-minute activity for our viewers to help them see the benefits of physical activities firsthand?
Absolutely. So we're going to make a pizza. It's almost dinner time. Pick up your pizza dough on one side. Whoa, it's heavy. Pick up that pizza dough on the other side. Let it tip you side to side. And getting ready. We're going to stretch out this dough. Are you coming with me here? Let's mush it, and we're going to pull it right apart. Here we go, and stretch that dough. Oh, that feels good. Stretch that dough. Pull that dough apart as wide as you can. Pull it apart. Now we're going to roll that dough. Are you ready? Roll that dough all around your body. Roll. Roll it out. Roll it back. I think we gotta maybe crush the tomatoes on our feet, under our feet. Crush, crush, crush. Want to do a cha-cha? Slow, slow. Quick, quick, slow. You got it. Now we're gonna sauce it up. Sauce it up. Spread that sauce. It's just moving the music. That's all we're doing. Making a pizza. Sauce it up. What else goes on a pizza, guys? How about we throw up some pepperoni and chop it around. Chop it all around your body. Chop it sideways. Chop. Chop it down. Throw it up in the air. Spin it. Spin your pizza. All right. We're going to serve it. Serve it. To everyone. That's it. I can't wait to eat this pizza. We're going to crush the tomatoes. Crush, crush. Quick, quick, slow. Crush, crush. Roll it out. Roll. Other side. Roll it out. Now let's flick on the cheese. Flick, flick, flick the cheese all over that pizza. And now put it in the oven. Take it out and take a bite. That was good, right? The heart rate came up. You were moving to music. That's called dance, using visualization and imagery. And I hope you have fun. And that's really the point. Find something that's fun to do.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was wonderful. We'd love now to hear from you and how you felt after this activity. Please share in the chat box. We're also going to go to our second live poll now. Again, you can scan the QR code that will appear on the screen, or you can go to slido.com and enter the hashtag TalkBrain, or the link will be provided in the chat box. Once again, only the first 100 people will be able to participate. So the question is, how active are you? Is physical activity something that you do every day, or is it something that you aspire to? We would love to hear that. So let's see how our poll results are. Let's see. Okay. So most of you, let's see, 35% are active 3 to 5 times per week. 13% looks like, around 3 times per week. And we have about 20% at 5 times a week, roughly. Let's see. And physical activity is my life. We have about a little more than a quarter there, doing physical activity 7 days a week. Incredible. That is great. Wonderful. Thank you so much for participating in that. So let's now take a question from the audience. Just a reminder, you can please send us your questions by directing your questions in to @OntarioBrain, or send an email to communications@braininstitute.ca. Here we go. Let's see. This question comes from Jerry Ann May via chat box. And her question is, how do you address people with major depression and complete lack of motivation? So not doing physical activity, even though we know it would help. I wonder, Patrick, maybe you might be able to take this question.
Yeah, thank you for that, Wency, and thank you for that question. It's absolutely brilliant. And something that we're doing at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health is really trying to understand how does physical activity impact mental health. And one of the things that we are seeing is that physical activity is what we would say an add-on to all of the other supports that someone might be receiving, such as cognitive behavioral therapy or just behavioral therapy, medication. And so what we do always is say physical activity is a tool that someone could use and should use, but by no means is it a be-all and end-all that's going to replace all the other supports. So that's the first place where I want to start, is to say it's a tool, it's important, but let's also recognize that there might be other supports that are needed. To do so, I think there's a few things that we can address in this issue. One, the concept of motivation is a really difficult one, right? We know, especially if someone who's diagnosed clinically with depression, their first choice isn't going to be physically active. And without support, such as potentially having a friend or understanding how they could benefit, they're less likely to be active. One way that we try to do this is that when they do come see someone at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health, if physical activity is part of their treatment plans, they will have a recreation therapist, for example, who's not only going to do activities with them, but to also support them and teach them so that they can do it on their own time. The hardest thing that we see at the hospital are people who don't know where to start, and they don't know even how to start. And I know it seems a little counterintuitive, because we would say, well, being active is super easy. We can go for a walk, we can rake the leaves. But when we are clinically depressed and when our brain is misfiring in so many different areas, our first thought isn't to be active. But again, if we can start to find ways and structures through either external supports, such as family or clinicians, to even get them over that first step, that is the biggest barrier, is getting people over that hump, and really trying to incorporate it into their lives. Oftentimes we see physical activity as something we have to do every single day, 7 days a week, for more than an hour at a time. But for people, especially with depression, if we do 5 minutes a day and we incorporate that as much as we can every single day, and we try and build on that, that certainly is, I would say, one way to start. I wonder if Laura has something else she wants to add to this potentially.
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you, Patrick. It made me think, actually, of a friend of mine. A friend of mine is a psychologist, and she offered group programs for people with severe mental health problems. And she used to talk about, just a little add-on, when people went from being at home to even coming to appointments, if they could, even if they drove there and they parked slightly further away and walked in, adding that, maybe it was only 1,000 steps, but that's that little starting point that Patrick was talking about. So it doesn't have to be much, especially for people experiencing severe mental health issues, for it to make a difference. It doesn't have to be those physical activity guidelines. Adding a few steps can make all the difference. And so if you can get people just outside in the sunshine, walking the block, that's a start. So I think starting with something that's not intimidating, that hopefully brings, just a pinch of joy, or it's just functional, getting them somewhere.
And I think I
Thank
just
you,
want
both
to
of
add
you.
to that before we move on quickly.
Yeah.
I think the hardest part, again, is getting started. But if we can, the greatest benefit for the curve when it starts to go this way actually is the starting point. And eventually, once we get someone going, that's the most important thing. And I was working with a client who, was diagnosed with depression, but what I also didn't know until it came out when we started trying to incorporate it was that he had a phobia of other people, especially during the daytime. KMH is close to downtown. It's super busy, always lots going on. And the simplest thing that I realized after he was able to share that with me is that he would go for a walk at 3 a.m. And I know that sounds counterintuitive, and the first instinct probably is like, this is a bad idea. But that's when he felt the most safe. That's when he felt like he was actually awake, and that was his time out of his mind that he was able to go and do that. And what we then did was support him through that and say, okay, well, when you leave and if your family feels safe, just let them know you're leaving. And when you come back, and putting those checkpoints ahead of time and finding that point in time, whether it's 11 p.m. or if it was 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. sometimes, really made all the difference. And again, it's trying to really build on not only understanding the person and not focusing on the deficits, but really trying to focus on their strengths. And if it's something we can improve or focus on, no matter what time of day, I always say there's time for some activity in there. And again, it's starting small and trying to build on that. And that's the hardest part, is starting. But you're not alone, and definitely there's a lot of help and support for you that people can get you there. So hopefully we can share that with the individual who asked the question, and please relay that back to them as well.
Great. Thanks so much. Patrick, on that idea about those barriers, I wonder if you can kind of elaborate and perhaps maybe share some anecdotes, some other anecdotes from youth that you work with about, what kind of barriers do they actually face?
Yeah, so again, I'll remind our viewers that I work with kids primarily with autism spectrum disorder, which is, a multifaceted challenge sometimes, but also a unique strength to their lives. So one of the challenges that they might experience would be, for example, a sensory hypersensitivity or a hypo. So hyper would be they have a really hard time adjusting to bright lights and bright noises in the environment or the heat. And so if you go into a gym, for example, where it's super bright, tons of mirrors, really noisy, that isn't what we would call an autism-friendly environment for some people who tend to experience that challenge. And that environmental challenge, that generally speaking, you walk into a gym and there's music sometimes pumping, that might not work for them. So one way that we would adapt that barrier is to find not only other ways or other spaces, such as, a sensory friendly gym that they might access, but then also think about other barriers that we can eliminate. So one of the other barriers that we often see are instructional barriers, where if we're even talking about, how to be physically active, if someone's not understanding that instructional barrier really just stops them from participating altogether. So it's finding ways that the youth have said to break down information so it makes sense to us, relay it to us in a way that we can comprehend it. Oftentimes I had a youth say, I don't care about all the big fancy science words that you guys are obsessed with, you scientists. I just want to know how to do it. And so that instructional barrier is certainly something that is experienced, but also something that we have to address. The last thing that I think is important to address, especially in this population, are policy barriers. And we talked earlier a little bit about policy with David and how, good policy can potentially improve people's lives. And so some of the youth I've worked with have talked about being removed from programs altogether because they were too risky, given that their behavior challenges, or because they didn't have a support worker. And it wasn't until some advocacy work with the City of Toronto that support workers were offered. And that doesn't mean that it's always going to be easy, but if we simply remove people because they don't have support workers, we just close that door altogether. So what we have to do from a policy level is spend more time finding ways that policies can support people either through funding or opportunities, and then make sure that we can get them through the door. It's one thing to say, okay, we're going to allocate this much amount of money for this funding opportunity to get people to do it. But unless we have a planned action and supports in place to get them through that door, oftentimes we see disabled people, generally speaking, don't come. So lots of work to do, and we have really focused on the benefits, but again, to think about that there's still room for improvement on our end in science, but also in the everyday life.
Right. Okay. And Laura, can you please speak to the barriers on that are faced by seniors?
Absolutely. And I think, like so much about accessibility, if we make it accessible for everyone, we address all those age groups. So much of what Patrick says resonates for older adults as well. Often when we think about barriers, we think about, people's physical abilities or their cognitive abilities. I work a lot with people living with dementia. So we think about, their memory and their attention. But it's important to think about it's not just their abilities, but the people around them and the community around them that determines whether they can participate. We had a clinical trial of people with mild cognitive impairment and dementia. And one of the major reasons people dropped out was because their spouse was sick. So while we think of the people living with dementia as the person needing care, we have to recognize they also provide care. So the health and support of those partners, their family members around them, is also really important. Another thing that came up in focus groups we did to understand barriers was transportation systems. Until the last 5 years, accessible transportation systems were often not available to people with cognitive impairment. They were given to people with physical impairments, but people with dementia were excluded. Now, fortunately, that's largely changed, mostly due to the advocacy of people living with dementia and their family members. But people living with dementia can now access transportation. One other thing that I'd add, though, and this is not just older adults or younger adults or people with disability, but I think it's important to recognize that there's an intersection too, where people of certain cultures or in locations may experience an interaction of effects, to do with barriers faced by their abilities, but also because cultural norms differ depending on where you come from, where you live, the people around you. This is especially the case for women, where sometimes it's still not the norm, and in certain age groups of women. So identifying, culturally relevant physical activities like dance, as Sarah showed us, can be a really important way that's, a meaningful physical activity that is more part of the norm as well to get people to participate.
Excellent, thank you. David, maybe you could elaborate on that, and maybe would you be able to share your thoughts on the cultural and social barriers to physical activities that people encounter and how they might be able to overcome them?
Yes, I think I don't have the answer as to how everyone can overcome every barrier. But one of the things that we need to be mindful of is that there are barriers posed by legislation. Laura talked a bit briefly about the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and one of the important things to note there is that legislation is a Western construct. And if you take the time, you Google Article 30, which is the article about participation in leisure and sport and recreation, there are all sorts of phrases that those of us who are against the convention have suggested are get out of jail free phrases, because they say wherever possible, where it's appropriate, and all these sorts of things. Your rights to activities are guaranteed if it's appropriate. Now, who's deciding who it's appropriate for? Who's empowered? Largely speaking, it's the able-bodied mainstream world. Ableism is an ideology that marginalizes people that are different in many ways. And it's similar to racism, sexism, and all the other isms, but it's about ability versus disability. And so we need to be mindful of the culture that we're in. There are certain cultural environments, like Laura said, where movement for women is controlled more strictly than it is for men, age differences and so on. We need to be aware of those things, but we also need to be aware that legislation isn't the answer to everything. Policies need to be policed. The UN Convention, 180 some countries have signed up for it, but it's not policed anywhere. And if your rights are infringed upon, the onus is placed on you to take the organization to court. So it's very, very difficult. It's a minefield.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's a lot of food for thought. We are now just going to go to our last live poll. Again, you can scan the QR code that appears on your screen, or you can go to slido.com and enter the hashtag TalkBrain, or the link will be provided in the chat box. And again, only the first 100 people will be able to participate. So the question is, where do you prefer to be active? Let's see. I wonder if many people now, especially with the weather being so nice out, prefer to be active outdoors, in the home. Let's see. We have gym or community center, home or gym and community centers, public spaces, dance or yoga studios. And hopefully at some point soon, we will have these places opening up, the gyms and community centers and dance and yoga studios for in-person activity again. Public spaces looks like by far the number one place that people like to be active. So it looks like public spaces, home or a gym and community centers. And we have a very small minority who do not believe in physical activity. There you go. All right. Thank you for answering that question. So let's take one more question from the audience here. Let's see. This is from Joan via chat box. So the level of obesity in Canada is increasing, given that lack of physical activity negatively impacts mental health. Have you noticed an increase in mental illness related to increase in obesity? Very interesting question. Thanks, Joan. Let me see. Maybe Laura, would you like to try to tackle that question?
Well, I'd be a little bit of a hard pressed to answer with exact statistics. I do think one of the challenges in really understanding changes in mental health over time is that our recognition and diagnosis of mental health has really changed, and even varies across age groups still and generations. So to compare year over year is quite difficult, although I would say that there's some recognition of issues to do with mental health and social isolation during the pandemic, of course. Cognitive health and dementia, we do know that there's some risk factors that have increased that make people, including obesity being one, that makes people worried for 20 or 30 years from now. But I can't comment directly on the link between obesity and mental health rates.
Great, thank you. Do any of our other speakers want to weigh in on this question?
I will.
Yeah.
Yes, I think one of the issues with something like obesity is that it's a social construction. It's a line that's drawn in the sand, and we need to be mindful that if the audience, and I don't know the age of the audience, and that's one of the things we didn't check, but if we think about Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was Conan the Barbarian, when he was at his biggest, when he was Mr. Universe and so on, his body is obese. We often think of people with large beer bellies and so on as potentially obese. We need to be mindful that we're just you just draw a line in the sand. So people that are obese are medically categorized, and they shouldn't be discouraged from being physically active. And certainly some people that are listed as medically obese are extremely physically active, like bodybuilders and so on. So nobody should be turned away from being physically active. And the link between mental health and obesity is not as clear in the social research, at least, as there being a direct link between the two.
Great. Thank you so much, David. Let's shift the conversation just a little bit. The role of connection and community in physical activity also feeds into the solutions. And so, David, back to you. As part of our earlier discussions, you had mentioned that there is a high burden on carers. Can you expand on that and offer some potential solution for carers?
Well, I think that is something that Laura has touched on already, in the sense that, if an individual has dementia, has mobility problems, has any, has difficulty moving about in the world, a carer might be needed to get them to engage in physical activity programs and so on. And often carers are family members, whether it be in elderly age, it might be spouses. It can also be parents of people with intellectual and developmental disability that get to an advanced age and are still looking after their offspring in a non-traditional way. And these individuals, particularly in a situation where there's a COVID pandemic, the research that we've been doing says that these individuals are extremely overburdened and aren't given respite from caring duties because of the stopping of a lot of the physical activity programs.
Okay, thank you. So, Patrick, how might we be able to build social connections, communities, and circles of trust, for kids both with and without disabilities?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question, Wency. And I think this kind of goes back to twofold piece that I'll address. The first things, when you talk to parents for kids both with and without disabilities, one of the first things that comes up isn't their brain health, it isn't their physical health, or worry about their heart or their lungs. It's the social piece, right? I mean, kids thrive being around other kids. Kids want to just be kids and climb that tree and do things and explore their environments. And one of the things that I would say that we haven't done so well as a society is we've really started to just police their activity in every single way. Think about all the streets that we live in that say no ball hockey playing or can't climb on this structure. And I'm not saying that we don't need to be safe. That's obviously important, but we need to find ways that we can bring activity back into their daily lives. And whether it's something as simple as walking to school, I have a colleague who has developed this concept called the walking school bus, where kids around the block meet up every single morning. They have one parent who walks the kids around in a school bus formation. It's the cutest thing in the world. 5-year-olds waddling to school. And, that starts from such an early age to get them to and from school. And not only do they get their movement in, but also they're building social connections. The other piece I would say that really starts that process is to start with empathy. And whether kids see disability or not, oftentimes kids just see kids. And when we start with empathy and a shared understanding of not only just respect and care, but also just realizing that there are differences early on in life and that those differences can persist. And starting with empathy as a starting point at the grassroots level. Again, we talk about policy being important and what governments can do, but organizing at the community level oftentimes goes way further than the 10, 15 years sometimes it takes research to get integrated into policy and vice versa, right? So rather than only waiting for the policymakers and the researchers to come up with maybe some of the solutions, it's important that we take some of this into our own hands and try and include this into our every single day kind of lives and activities. And the number one thing that I oftentimes have to kind of debunk with parents is parents often think about physical activity just being sport, right? We're thinking about playing on a sports team or being part of a dance class, but it could be so much simpler than that. And I always say physical activity isn't just sport. It could be anything and everything from cleaning up with the kids and making that fun and engaging, connecting with them, or again, non-COVID times and hopefully soon in COVID times, safely distanced, being able to have kids play outside and have play dates where they're just exploring their environment and just learning how to move. Because we know kids who are confident movers early on are more likely to be active later on. So again, working at the ground level, starting with families and then building up to the policy level, I think is one way that we can start moving that forward. And it's something that we don't hear often enough. And parents need that support and they are tired, especially during a pandemic. So kudos to everyone who's trying and kudos to everyone who has been able to get their kids active to date.
Thanks, Patrick. Hey, Sarah, what lessons can you share from your own experience about how to build community and support systems?
Well, I think speaking specifically about our program, it's really important for everyone who tries our class out to understand that there is no wrong. In dance is a non-verbal way to express ourselves. So however you want to express yourself through your body is absolutely the right way. We are all dancers. Actually, every single person on this earth is a dancer because we all have this innate response to a beat in our heart, right? So when the music goes on, however, if you're reaching up to here, or you're down here, or you're here, all of those things are the right thing to do because you are moving, you're engaging, you're responding, you're expressing yourself, you're being artistic. So that is something that's really important for every single person who comes to our class to understand that they are doing the right thing just by being there and listening to the music. We have people who take our classes in wheelchairs, some from hospital beds, some people are standing, and a lot of our dancers do the class seated, as I did with you earlier on. And all of those things are absolutely the right thing. So that is definitely super important for everyone to know that dance is accessible to everyone because any way that you do it and respond to the music is the right way to do it. And it has this beautiful benefit that it is this multidisciplinary activity that really does work our cognition, right? When we're working on retaining steps and learning choreography, it's working with neuroplasticity. We're working on the physical self. We're, working on our flexibility, our core strength, our posture, making our muscles strong and able. And then that emotional side of that expression, the connecting with others, and really letting ourselves be transported when we hear the music. So dance is for everyone. Everyone who takes the class is a dancer.
That's so reassuring to hear, especially for someone like me who has two left feet and no rhythm. But Sarah, I wonder, what advice do you have for people just to make that first step, and just get to sign up to begin with and get out of their get out of their comfort zones?
Well, I mean, what I would say to anyone is these are tough times. Do you want to share a laugh? Do you want to say hello? Do you want to hear some music? Do you want to get a little bit of exercise that doesn't feel like exercise? We all need to make sure that we're doing things that we find are fun, right? Fun and beneficial. If I'm going to say, I need to get in shape, so I'm going to make myself run for 1 hour on the treadmill every day, and I hate it, I'm probably not going to do it day after day. So, I say, try out new things, find your community, find a friend, or, like our dance community, and just give it a shot. And if it feels good, you'll probably want to do it again the next day or a few days later. So just give it a shot.
Great, thank you. Laura, now that we have a better understanding of the science and the challenges, how does one kind of begin to incorporate physical activity as part of their daily routines?
Yeah, I feel like Patrick and Sarah have got into so many of the strategies, really. There's a lot of ways to get started, and the right way really depends on where you're at and what you like. I think of there as two kind of global strategies, and one came from a neurologist I talked about, and not surprisingly, this is kind of a clinical medical. He said it should be like brushing your teeth. You do it every day, you do the prescription, and I could give you a prescription. I could tell you if you walk every day and maybe you do chair stands and some push-ups against the wall, then you're doing pretty well. But I like the approach that Sarah and Patrick have talked about. You think about what you enjoy and try to integrate that into your activity, starting with small ways. For many people, the social piece of exercise or physical activity is really important. So you might go for a walk with a friend instead of going for a coffee. Not that we can go for a coffee right now. You might take your dog for a walk. You might dance with your children or grandchildren. All of these are incredibly meaningful ways that you can enjoy at the same time. But it might be different, for the gentleman that Patrick mentioned. Those are social ways, but for some people, it might be a chance to get some quiet, some meditation, and then you might exercise at a different time. But, there's little ways every day you can get started. whether it's walking or it's gardening or it's dancing to the music on the radio. I think whatever works for you that you enjoy is probably the best way to get started.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Laura. So we'll take one more question from the audience. This one is from Loida via chat box. Loida's asking, how about youth having depression? How about youth who have depression or have had mood swings and isolated to others? Is there anything more that you might add about how we can engage them and keep them active? And this question I'll let Patrick answer.
I'll start and I'll see if Laura wants to add anything. I think so. In this context, again, it just really depends on the individual and getting to know them and how they work. So, like we talked about, the individual, if it was late at night or time away from people, that is what they might need. In this context, for this youth, I'm particularly thinking about something that is structured, something that they know every single day on Monday at 3 p.m. that they're going to be doing this activity, or Tuesday at 10 a.m. they're going for a walk. Something that they can program into their phones, into their calendars, into their daily lives to make it a habit. Like Laura said, like brushing your teeth is the best way to start getting them to get into that groove. And like I said before, the hardest part is getting into the groove, but getting them started by creating a structure, a routine, a sense of predictability. How many of us know it's like, oh, I need to be active today. I'm just going to try and fit into my schedule. And then we realize we have 100 other things we have to do. It almost never happens, right? So structure would be the first starting point. The second thing I'd want to say is to incorporate throughout our day. Again, oftentimes we think we have to do these things for hours on end, and unless we do them, we don't get the benefits. But it's a term that I've heard over and over and over. It's something called an exercise snack, where rather than just doing it for an hour straight, let's incorporate throughout the day. 5 minutes, let's say 6 times a day is half an hour. That's half an hour more than we did at 5-minute intervals. And when we add those 5 minutes, it has what we call a cumulative benefit, where that time adds up, those benefits add up. So for this youth, same thing. Try and add it at small chunks and incorporate it. A way to remember how to do that, if you're at home or you're playing a board game or you're on the computer, when you go to the bathroom, do some movement, whether it's a little bit of yoga or stretching, or whether it's a few squats or whatever it can be. It's really trying to program it into your day for someone who really might need that support early on. And then it becomes just so routine that you don't even think about it. For me, for example, especially with some of the clients I work with, going for a morning walk is something that they just have to do. And once they've had to learn how to put that in, and that it required going to bed earlier and waking up earlier. But once you're able to structure that, put a program in place and provide that, we've seen them really now doing it on their own, and they don't need to reach out for further intervention. So that's what I would say for this particular youth: structure and a bit of opportunity to explore.
Great. Thanks so much, Patrick. We're getting close to the end of the hour here. So let me just ask to each of our panelists, what would you like the audience to take away from this conversation? Something to help themselves and to support their community. Let us start with Laura.
I think that physical activity can be any sort of movement, and creating support for both yourself and the people around you to be active and enabling other people is something that's really meaningful and can benefit you in a huge number of ways.
Excellent. How about Sarah? Any last thoughts from you?
Absolutely. I think I want to echo Laura and Patrick and talk about those sort of small, attainable goals each day, the 5 minutes at a time. So every little bit adds up. Exercise is cumulative, and finding something that you find is fun to do will probably help you stick with it, because consistency is the key to feeling better all the time. And yeah, I think I would leave it at that.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And David, what about you? Some final thoughts?
I would just echo what all the other speakers have said, but the movement pattern that we engage in should be something that we're passionate about. That your lifestyle can facilitate some of the points that Patrick put forward, about doing chunks and so on, are really, really important. But pick something that, life is about passion. The dance that was led by Sarah in the middle of the session was an impassioned building of a pizza. But it was something that you could tell by the way that she was demonstrating it, that it was something that she is passionate about. Your movement culture should be something that you're passionate about.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you. And last but not least, Patrick, your final, any final takeaways from you?
I'm going to build on what David just said in terms of movement cultures and really moving away from just, obsessing about these very fit, muscular, jacked bodies to just think about physical cultures, groups in places where we find meaning and excitement and purpose, which bring us some sort of joy. I think if we can bring physical culture back and stop obsessing as much about the sexiness of activity, I think we'll be good.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So on behalf of the Ontario Brain Institute, thank you so much to the presenters and to the audience for joining us tonight. We do have some resources to share with you for more information around this topic. We will post them on the screen shortly, and they are also available on the OBI website. As a viewer, your feedback is valuable to us. We have a survey link in the chat box. Please share your thoughts with us about tonight's talk. OBI talks are designed to share the latest knowledge on brain health and to offer simple tips to manage both health and wellness. OBI's current set of public talks is called the Wellness Series. So this series explores the brain's vital relationship to nutrition and physical activity, the neurotech that's available to help improve your day-to-day lives, and personal stories of people living with brain disorders. So to sign up for the next talk in August, you can find a link in the chat box or on our website. Thank you very much. Good night.